Okay, welcome to the next stop. We've moved a little bit further along the Stanley Park seawall. I'm standing in a bike lane, so every now and then cyclists are going to come past and we'll just have to work with that. But this is a really nice rock to look at, and if you get a chance to come and take a look, I encourage you to do so. So this is a Cretaceous sedimentary rock called the Nanaimo group. And it's a nice example of a sedimentary outcrop which is not beautiful. So you've just seen one part of the outcrop, and if we pan and look this way, you can see that it's not easy at the beginning to interpret exactly what's going on here. We think of sedimentary rocks as having very clear, hardly defined beds with different layers. Here we don't see that. There's no really clear bedding, and that's because we're on a coastline. So the sea here has weathered and eroded this rock face. It's smoothed it out. We also have a wet rock face here, so there's a lot of groundwater flowing through here. So under the ground we always have the groundwater table, and that water is flowing out towards base level, whether that's a river or whether that's the sea in this case, and that means it's all coming out of the rock face. That's weathering it as well as the sea action, and we've got all these plants here. So it's a difficult one to start to interpret, but it's a good example of how we can go about doing that. So if we come and look closer up, I told you already this is a sedimentary rock, and you probably initially looked at this part up here because we don't have all this moss growing on the front of it. So you can see that this is sedimentary. Perhaps you can see some layering. If you look down here, you can see there's a change in the grain size. We have some pebbles here. If you were doing a detailed description of this, which we are going to do tomorrow, so this Nanaimo group is going to feature tomorrow. We're going to explore this in more detail, and you're going to look at another location, not this outcrop, but another part of it, in detail by doing a sedimentary log, where you study these features in a systematic way, and we'll train you how to do that. But at this location, to give you an idea of what you would look for, you would start at the base and work your way up. Keep going. So you would start by describing this pebble layer, and there's a mixture of different class lithologies in here. So we have igneous, metamorphic, probably also some sedimentary, and you could do an analysis of those rock types, which we won't do now, but you could do in detail to look at provenance. That means the sources, the source rocks which are supplying material to this sedimentary rock. You could also describe the texture of those sedimentary layers. So these pebbles are relatively rounded. You could look for things like imbrication that give you a transport direction. If we move up the outcrop, perhaps less than a meter, about 1 meter or so, we can see that the sediment here has changed. We have a bit of layering inside it, and we can identify that layering from a change in color, and when you're up close, also a change in grain size. I can tell you that these grains here are about 0.5 millimeter on average in size. So I would describe that as a coarse sandstone, and in the back of your field notebooks, your yellow books, you've got grain size tables and charts where it tells you what's a coarse sandstone, what's a medium. This is a coarse sandstone. So that means going up this layer, we've gone from pebbles to sand, and that means we have grading. We call that grain size grading. In this case, we've got normal grading because the unit is becoming finer grained as we go up. If you had the opposite case and it became coarser going up in a layer, then we would call that reverse grading. Let's look at some of the other features that help us interpret this rock. You can probably see this pattern here. We have a layer that doesn't look very conventional. It's not a flat bed, and it's not following any other pattern in the outcrop. This red layer, if you follow it along, comes along up here, and then we have this funny pattern here which curves around and then comes back down. And maybe in the other parts of the rock face you can also see some layers that look like they've been deformed in a kind of wavy way. This is not bedding, and it's not cross bedding either, because we don't have any forceps. We're going to look at cross bedding in the afternoon in more detail. This is something that we call convolute bedding, That's a term you don't really need to worry about remembering. It's soft sediment deformation. So this sediment was deposited, saturated with water. It was wet. And then when the next layer came on top, it was squashed and it was deformed. So it was still soft when it was buried by the next layer. And that allows us to form these curved, waving structures rather than just getting flat laminations or crossbedding. That's an important clue that you can see in this outcrop, because it tells us that we're dealing with a depositional environment where the sediment was saturated with water and then it was rapidly buried by another layer while it was still wet, and that gave us soft sediment deformation. So that's an indication, if we jump to the interpretation, that this was deposited in a marine setting because it was completely saturated, and that we probably also had quite rapid sedimentation because it didn't have a chance to solidify and lithify into a stable layer before the next unit was deposited on top. It was still soft and was moving around. If we keep going up in the outcrop, I hope if I move this way, you can probably see up there, maybe you can see in the video, there's some crossbedding. So the crossbedding is more systematic. We have these sloping draped lines just about up here. It might not come out, but we can take a photo. And that indicates a unidirectional flow. You can keep going. We're going to look at crossbedding this afternoon. Crossbedding indicates a unidirectional flow. It's formed by bed forms, so the interaction of a sedimentary bed, something like sand, with a unidirectional flow. In this case, that would have been water, and it forms crossbedding. So we had another layer then deposited on top that squashed this layer with the soft sediment deformation that has evidence of a paleo flow direction, and you could perhaps reconstruct paleo flow hydraulics, which we're going to look at this afternoon.